Henry belongs with me. Queen Catherine de Medici hated Diane de Poitiers for stealing her husband, King Henry. Still, Diane flaunted the affair in the Queen's face. But when Catherine got revenge, it was jaw-droppingly brutal. Born into an aristocratic family in January of 1500, Diane grew up wanting for absolutely nothing and had close ties to the French throne. Her father, Jean de Poitiers, was one of the most cunning nobles of his day, and Diane had inherited his intelligence and his ambition, two very dangerous things for a woman of the time to possess. When Diane was only 15 years old, her well-to-do family put her on the marriage market, hoping to cart their girl off into an advantageous match. Their plan worked too well, and Diane caught the eye of Louis de Bracy, a grandson of the old King Charles V. They married in 1515, with the de Poitiers rejoicing in the huge fish they had snagged for their daughter. While the barely teenage Diane was naive and obedient to her parents' wishes, her wedding was a horror story. After all, her new husband was almost 40 years older than her, and for the life expectancy of the day, practically had one foot in the grave. For a beautiful, sprightly girl like Diane, it must have been like a prison sentence. So maybe that's why she began to act out in a big way. By this point, Diane was famous around town for her boundless energy, and her marriage to Louis increased that nervous activity tenfold. In 1523, just as Diane might have been about to settle down as a married woman, her life got ripped apart. Her husband Louis, ever the obedient royalist, uncovered a plot against the current king, Francis I, and exposed the men involved. Only he wasn't aware of one very crucial detail. Diane's father, Jean, was right in the middle of the plot. The king immediately sentenced Diane's father to execution for his role in the conspiracy, and the whole du Poitiers family had to work overtime to save their patriarch. Always persuasive, Diane and her relatives did eventually convince King Francis to stay the execution. Even so, the damage was done. Jean went to prison for years afterward, and his health was never the same again. Diane must have been none too happy with her knucklehead of a husband, but don't worry, she got very even. Although King Francis's son Henry was only 7 years old when Diane was a blossoming woman in her 20s, she apparently made quite the impression on the boy. When the prince went to Spain in 1526 as a diplomatic hostage, it was Diane serving as a lady-in-waiting to his grandmother, who gave the boy a ceremonial goodbye kiss. It was a small gesture, and it had enormous effects. Historians now believe that following this moment, little Henry began to develop a massive crush on Diane de Poitiers. As it happened, Henry spent 4 long years in Spain as a hostage, but he also spent every one of those years yearning for Diane, idealizing her in his mind as the perfect gentlewoman. In 1531, Prince Henry had his long-awaited homecoming, and he and Diane immediately set tongues wagging. At the coronation of his new stepmother, Queen Eleanor of Austria, all of Henry's family wore the new queen's colors as a gesture of respect. Well, everyone except Henry, that is. Instead, the 12-year-old wore Diane's colors in a public declaration of his weird obsession. Just months after the prepubescent Prince Henry came back to France and started trying to seduce the 30-something Diane, her elderly husband finally kicked the bucket. At long last, Diane broke free from her patriarchal shackles. She wasted no time reinventing herself as a single woman. While Diane was building a brand for herself, she was also concocting a devious plot. Even a fool could see how in love Prince Henry still was with her, and Diane was no fool. She craftily used his not-so-little crush for her own benefit, keeping herself at arm's length from his bed, but nonetheless getting closer and closer and consolidating her power over him. Until there was a big bump in her plan. Every prince needs a wife, and in 1533 Henry's family married the 14-year-old off to Catherine de Medici, an Italian noblewoman from the notorious and notoriously wealthy de Medici clan. At first, Diane might have thought she was in big trouble, what with Catherine actually being Henry's age and fully endorsed by his royal parents. That's when Diane really put her plot into action. In many ways, Catherine de Medici played right into Diane de Poitiers' hands. For one, Catherine wasn't particularly good-looking, while Diane was a noted beauty. For another, while Diane came from aristocratic stock, people sniffed at the new bride's common merchant origins. In short, Diane understood that Catherine was an asset she could control. Just months after Henry's marriage to Catherine de Medici, Diane committed an act that has gone down in infamy. At 35 years old, many historians believe Diane slept with the now 15-year-old Henry herself, finally giving the princeling what he had wanted for so long. After years of machinations and playing the long game, Diane de Poitiers was officially a royal mistress. Catherine de Medici was wild with jealousy, but Diane knew what to do. She positioned herself as, if not Catherine's friend, then at least an experienced advisor to help her learn the ropes of the new court. Catherine's duty as Henry's wife was to give him an heir, but there was one huge problem. As the months rolled into years, then rolled into a decade, Catherine and Henry were still childless. This was actually very bad news for Diane, too, who feared having to ingratiate herself with a new queen if there was a royal divorce. Diane started recommending all sorts of fertility treatments for the increasingly despondent Catherine, including drinking mule urine. Throughout these years, Henry was still so glued to Diane's side, she had to start insisting that he go to Catherine and his marriage bed more frequently, in the hopes that he could finally get a legitimate heir. In 1543, Catherine was pregnant at long last, and in January 1544 gave birth to a coveted boy, Francis. Incredibly, 9 other children followed in short succession, with Catherine pretty much constantly pregnant for over a decade afterward. But if Catherine thought this meant she'd gotten rid of Diane de Poitiers, she was wrong. With Catherine's fertility issues resolved, Henry proved his love to Diane with a grand gesture. In 1544, the same year Henry's first son was born, an enemy of Diane's at court accused her of being involved in a plot against the current King Francis I. As a result, Francis banished Diane from Paris, and Henry was absolutely furious. He and his followers left the royal court and went to Diane's chateau, with Henry refusing to even speak to his father for a year after that. In 1547, Diane got what she always wanted. That year, Henry's father died, making her boy Toy the King of France. The minute he took the reins, Henry swooped Diane back up into the courts in her circle and banished many of the enemies who had exiled her before. Diane de Poitiers was on top of the world, which meant there was nowhere to go but down. Diane's reign as the Shadow Queen of France started out gloriously. She even got a legendary dig at the newly minted Queen Catherine de Medici, when the Pope sent Catherine the customary golden rose bouquet, a ceremonial floral sculpture. The head of the Catholic Church also made sure to include a pearl necklace just for Diane. As Diane settled in as chief mistress to the King of France, she took to the role like a duck to water. After all, she'd always been whip-smart and had proven it by amassing a tidy fortune over the years. It was only natural then that Henry relied on Diane for advice, even getting her to write letters for him and signing them under a joint name. While Henry was giving Diane political power hand over fist, he staunchly kept Catherine de Medici away from his affairs. Then, mad with lust and love, Henry gave his mistress, not his wife, the literal crown jewels of France, infuriating Catherine. Then he went and gifted his favorite girl with the gorgeous Chateau de Chenonceau, a palace both Diane and Catherine had their eyes on. After one for modesty, Diane immediately moved in and started throwing lavish parties, rubbing it in Catherine's face. To Catherine, this was the final straw. The gloves were now off, and it would be Diane's doom. In public, Catherine de Medici restrained herself, but her private life reveals a dark truth. Queen of France was spitting with bitterness at Diane. People always considered Diane a beauty, but as she grew older, she somehow still kept the glow of youth. Obviously, Diane had good genes to spare, but that didn't mean she wasn't getting a little external help on the side. Indeed, rumor has it that Diane would drink liquid gold in the hopes that it would provide her with eternal beauty. But just as Diane was about to turn 60, her whole world changed. In 1559, Diane was still living as a royal mistress and was attending a jousting tournament to watch her lover, King Henry, try and best all the men of his court. Naturally, the king was insultingly wearing Diane's signature black and white colors as he jousted, but on that day, karma was finally coming to get them. As Diane looked on at her knight in shining armor, she was met with the shock of her life. When the king faced the rookie Count of Montgomery, the upstart almost hit the monarch right out of his saddle. Annoyed, the king demanded they ride again so he could prove his dominance. He should have just walked away. The next run, Montgomery's lands splintered right into the king's face, and when the dust settled, horror reigned. In the next moments, Diane watched as Henry's face gushed with blood, and wooden splinters embedded themselves in his eye. The sight was so gruesome, the hardened Diane as well as Catherine de Medici and her son Prince Francis all fainted the minute they realized what they were seeing. Attendants immediately rushed to the fallen king and brought him to a doctor. The news was gut-wrenching. 5 splinters of the lands had buried themselves in his head, and one in particular had pierced through his eye and into his brain. The next few days were agony for everyone involved. As King Henry's life hung in the balance, Diane de Poitiers was nowhere to be found. Catherine de Medici had taken full control of the situation, and Diane kept away from Henry's sickbed for fear that Catherine would embarrassingly dismiss her anyway. Despite not being able to see her lover, Diane likely held out hope that since Henry survived the initial blow of the lands, he would pull through. And for a while, it looked like the king would indeed make a miraculous recovery. Some days he could talk, he often listened to music, and he even dictated letters from his bed. Diane's prayers were coming true, until it took a cruel twist. In July, months after the jousting incident, Henry's health and mental state went into a decline, and he gradually lost everything: his sight, his sanity, and then his life on July 10th. Diane's constant companion had passed at the age of 40, and her rival, Catherine de Medici, was now the powerful queen mother to Henry's young legitimate son, Prince Francis. Diane's influence at court depended completely on Henry's devotion to her, and after his passing, she experienced a very rude awakening. Queen Catherine de Medici was in full-on vengeance mode, and she set her sights squarely on Diane. She not only forced the former mistress to give back those coveted crown jewels, but she also yanked back Diane's beautiful Chateau de Chinon. After watching Diane make a name for herself at court, Catherine had learned a thing or two about image management herself. In what was almost certainly a dig at Diane, as well as plain good propaganda, Catherine immediately took up an image of a broken lance as her emblem after her husband's death, the lance that Henry had decorated with Diane's colors at the time of the accident. The end of Diane de Poitiers' life was even more tragic than her fall from grace. After losing favor in court, the cunning woman knew it was game over, and she retreated into the background to her Château d'Anay, watching from afar as Catherine de Medici meddled in France's affairs. It's possible the great mistress could have made a comeback, only she didn't live long enough to stage one. Soon after King Henry II's untimely demise, Diane suffered a horrific fate that mirrored her lost lover. However, the athlete, she stubbornly refused to stop riding horses with all the vim and vigor of a woman 40 years younger. And just like Henry, this stubborn arrogance cost Diane the ultimate price. In 1565, when she was 64, Diane was out riding when she fell off her mount, incurring enormous injuries. She never quite recovered. The infamous Mistress tried her best to keep going, but died a year later, all while Queen Catherine de Medici was at the height of her powers in France. But this wasn't Diane's last indignity. Diane de Poitiers was an unforgettable historical figure, and that didn't end up serving her well. Hundreds of years after she died, her enemies got in one final blow. During the French Revolution, citizens opened up Diane's tomb, desecrated her remains, and then threw them in a mass grave along with other aristocrats of France's bygone age. This dishonor also opened up a stunning discovery, with Diane free from her stately tomb beginning in the late 18th century. Modern historians were able to take full advantage of their more liberal access to her remains, and in 2009, their findings shocked the world. French experts reviewed her body and discovered traces of gold in her hair. This discovery fundamentally alters Diane's story. Although previously historians believed her riding injuries led to her demise, the gold suggests something else. Not only are the stories of Diane drinking gold likely true, but this dangerous beauty regime also may have led to her sharp decline. Diane de Poitiers was certainly worthy of the obsession that Henry heaped on her, and she knew it. Of all the royal mistresses in history, Diane may have been the vainest. She even made her likeness into a sculpture of a Roman goddess, and then put the statue in the middle of one of her castles. Another of Diane's favorite pastimes was posing nude for portraits. One of the more famous possible depictions of her is François Clouet's A Lady in Her Bath. Although experts aren't sure whether the woman is Diane or Mary Queen of Scots, many historians put their bets on Diane, partly because nude portraiture was just her thing. Queen Catherine de Medici and Diane de Poitiers had one of the most bitter rivalries in royal history, but it was Catherine who struck the most hateful blow. We now know that the entire time King Henry II of France knew he was dying, he called out for Diane to comfort him on his deathbed. Catherine's response was devious. The house always wins, and the House of Medici certainly always wins. Cold-hearted and bitter, Catherine staunchly refused to let her heart-sick husband even see Diane in his final moments, and the lovers never got to say goodbye. Perhaps even more cruelly, Catherine also barred Diane from Henry's funeral, leaving his most devoted companion bereft at his passing.